Hel- Hello and welcome. Wonderful to have everyone here. This is a discussion. This is Divestment, Why Strategies and How To, sponsored by the Hero Hatchery. I'm incredibly honored to have in the room today Deirdre Smith, who will be back in just a moment. She is the Divestment and Reinvestment Organizer from 350.org. Dinah DeWald, Maypop Collective Organizer and formerly of Swarthmore College. Jess Grady-Benson, successful organizer from Pitzer College, and Hero Hatchery fellow Lauren Wood. This is part of Hero Hatchery's ongoing series of massive open online trainings. And the mission of Hero Hatchery is to create recognizable figures that can humanize climate change. We're doing these series of massive open online trainings to spread greater information to the movement. And this is in a long series of trainings. Look for former trainings on herohatchery.org about ecological economics, and in the future there'll be future ones about reinvestment and a price on carbon and so on. We are taking questions on Twitter. You can tweet at HeroHatchery, hashtag HHDivestment. And in addition to this discussion, which we're having with these fabulous people live, there are also many resources that'll be just below in the YouTube page. So I'd like to just get to know the people in the room a little bit better. First, let me throw it out to Deirdre Smith. I'd like to know just a little bit more about your background and why you're excited about divestment. Oh, wait a moment.
Thanks. So I really started organizing in New Mexico around the impacts of coal and just watching how not only the pollution that was coming out of the San Juan generating station, the coal plant that we were working to transition, impacted the community, but also how drought and wildfires were really impacting our ability to not only organize but just survive, and how much farmers were threatened and our basic needs were threatened amidst organizing for pollution. Really had me focus on how climate is impacting, what kind of climate impacts go somewhat unseen, and who and that the figures that are causing a lot of these impacts to worsen often are invisibilized. And so I was really excited to take my lessons of the necessity of grassroots leadership towards building a just transition towards the solutions we need on the ground, leveraging that power towards an larger scale movement towards climate justice, and what would it look like to connect those communities and to contest for power. And so I was really excited about divestment because it was we stopped focusing on just coal or just oil, just gas, and by naming the fossil fuel industry as our #1 target, it started to create visibility around climate impacts, and so I thought that was exciting. I also am really interested and have been around how those in power that want to do the right thing, and I'm not talking about the fossil fuel industry as much as I'm talking about those with a lot of given power, like students, can leverage that power back towards climate justice. So yeah, that's kind of how I got in.
And then tell us a little bit about what you do at 350. I think you said you were focused on divestment, and now you're focused on reinvestment, which seems like an exciting opportunity to really understand the whole ecosystem of this movement.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I was a national divestment organizer, and now have been working with grassroots partners, a lot of our power communities, to develop a reinvestment strategy. And so, really went from, and was inspired by a lot of the movement actors sectors already. I think Dinah will talk a little bit about Swarthmore and how to use different ideas of how to use divestment as a solidarity tactic. But I think one of the best ways we can be in solidarity with climate justice is through reinvestment. And so I'm really, so I'm still working with a lot of the same incredible young leaders, actually leaders of all ages, on divestment, and then figuring out how we can strengthen our strategies for climate justice through reinvestment.
That's great. Wonderful, thank you. 350 obviously is a cornerstone of this movement. And let me turn it to Dinah. I'd love to know a little bit about your background, relationship with divestment, and why are you excited about divestment as a tactic?
Yeah, thanks. So the reason that I became involved in activism in general was through the divestment campaign at Swarthmore College. So being part of a campaign that is working specifically to make a positive change in the world, that introduced me to ideas of power and who do we think of as having power, and how can we become empowered to take control and ownership of our own local institutions, and really realize that we're the ones who can make that change and have that power to leverage. And so that's why I'm really excited about divestment. Is I see that this tactic as being something that can really build a huge base of people in their local areas that can become empowered to focus on how they and their neighbors and their community can make a positive change. Yeah. You wanted to know more about it.
Yeah, so we'll get into that a little bit more. I'll be asking you in just a moment a little bit about the history of the movement. And I'm excited to hear your response to that. Next, Jess Grady-Benson. Again, just give me a little bit about you and your relationship with divestment and why you're excited about it, if you could.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So I'm Jess. I just graduated from Pitzer College in Southern California, one of the Claremont colleges. And I got involved in divestment 2 years ago when I got in contact with Deirdre Smith from 350, and we organized about 75 to 100 students from the Claremont colleges to attend the Do the Math tour. And starting after that event and holding a rally at UCLA for divestment, we kicked off our campaign that year. And this spring, in April, we won divestment at Pitzer and reinvestment in the Climate Action Plan, which we're really, really psyched about. But basically, the reason that I got involved in divestment in the first place was I chose Pitzer because of its strong environmental analysis program academically. And Pitzer and the 5 Cs generally espouse this very progressive, pro-environmental action, pro-climate change action image, and yet the institution was not following through and aligning with those values, both in terms of their investments and their actions, and generally becoming very frustrated with political stagnancy around climate change issues, as well as the mainstream discourse, which completely has ignored historically the human story of climate change and the disproportionate impacts that result from climate change effects like worsening storms, and also the fossil fuel industry and extractive industries in general affecting disadvantaged communities and minority communities historically much worse. So I'm really inspired and excited about how divestment has really worked to change the mainstream narrative around climate change and shift the discourse, as well as mobilize huge numbers of students and young people to act in the climate justice movement. Over the past few years, it's just grown immensely, and I think that we have a lot of power in that we're winning, so it's really exciting.
That's amazing. I love that the interconnection of the people that we have on this training, and also to hear that that was just a couple years from the start to the finish of the movement, or of that effort. That's pretty exciting. Next, Miss Lauren Wood, Hero Hatchery Fellow. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organizing efforts, and why are you excited about divestment as a tactic?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Well, you know, I mean, I myself was never involved in my own campus in a divestment movement, largely because the the breadth of it hadn't really sunk in yet for the nation, and I was pretty distracted trying to advocate for nonviolent civil disobedience in my own community, which is a pretty conservative state. But through doing work, pushing similar narratives in the movement with Peaceful Uprising of trying to tell a human story and talk about ethics and values, it became clear to me as I moved through different circles of this movement that a lot of the people and students working in the divestment movement had one of the best perspectives and kind of most comprehensive perspectives on this work. So that kind of ignited my excitement in the issue, was just meeting people and hearing what they had to say. Now that I've spent some time learning a lot more about it, the reason that I think it is the coolest thing happening, or the thing I'm most excited about in this movement, is as someone who's constantly trying to bring more people into the climate justice movement, I feel like divestment is this really awesome foot in the door for people who would otherwise not necessarily think about joining the movement, but they see this really clear connection on their campus and people articulating a very easy argument. So it's a way for me to think about movements growing quite rapidly, because let's be honest, historically speaking, students have had a huge part in any sort of movement building, which is also why I think it's so cool. It's like we have this youth engagement, and to be honest, almost unlike any other crisis or social justice issue in the past, it's the youth that are inevitably going to have such a different perspective and broad view of climate justice, because we're going to be the people who have to live here in a couple generations. So I'm super excited about that, and I'm super excited that, as Jess was saying, divestment's forcing this ethical conversation into the mainstream, and forcing people to really connect some seemingly unrelated dots: economics, social justice, environmental justice, which all encompass this, kind of jargony term that we keep throwing out, climate justice. It's about the dot connecting there, and I think divestment, as we'll learn today, articulates that really well. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
Thanks, Lauren. Just to say again, we'd love to have questions from those that are watching, so you can tweet at Hatchery, HH Divestment, and we'll be focusing on that sort of at the end of the discussion here. I think a good place to start maybe is just to start at the beginning chronologically, and so I'm sort of curious maybe from Dinah, if you want to talk about the beginning of divestment, its relationship with apartheid, and relationship with sort of student power as a way to frame sort of the beginning of the journey as we sort of go chronologically to discover where we are now and what the future looks like.
Totally. So yeah, the Swarthmore campaign really was sort of on the leading edge of fossil fuel divestment. The reason that it came to be was a bunch of students at Swarthmore around 2010, 2011 went down to Appalachia, to West Virginia, and to see the resistance to mountaintop removal that's going down there. And because of meeting the people there and seeing the wholesale destruction of the environment, but also people's lives and livelihoods, that was what inspired us to think, how can we as students, somewhere not locally based on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction, how can we leverage our power with our institution to serve this fight in solidarity with them? And so we began this process of thinking of what tactic would make sense, and we discovered this rich history of the divestment campaigns around the country that were going on in the late 70s and 80s around South African divestment, or South African apartheid. And Swarthmore College did actually divest from apartheid, and we said this makes a lot of sense as a solidarity tactic, and this would also make sense in the context of the fossil fuel industry, where we want to just there's a moral taint on the entire industry, and it's causing all of these this immense injustice around the world. And so that's where we decided to do this, and that's sort of where we discovered the power of students and student-led struggles to really galvanize action on a lot of levels. So it's not the only tactic to be used, but it's a tactic in, you know, a sort of milieu of the movement to actually use the youth energy to galvanize political action and other action in a large social movement against climate injustice. So that's a little historical context of it.
That's great. And then when was that active? Like, when was Swarthmore, like, around what year was that happening?
So it was around 2011 that we started the campaign. Yeah, and at that time we were the first campus calling for full divestment from fossil fuels, although there were other campuses that had started a coal divestment. We were part of a handful.
That's really inspiring, and not that long ago.
Yeah.
Like, really good 2011, pretty recently. Maybe that's a good segue to Deirdre to sort of maybe take us from that point and sort of like into the present, and someone that I would say has probably the finger on the pulse maybe best. Sort of catch us up and give us sort of the state of play of fossil fuel divestment and where are we at and current state.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo a little bit, Dinah, because I think, you know, in 350 also in kicking off divestment, we studied and talked about it a lot, and looked at the long history of divestment, and really including like back to the slave trade in England and how Quakers used divestment. And one thing we realized is, like, we as a movement have yet to set up this moral high ground. Okay, sure, we're, you know, and I think that was a huge piece of using the tactic as setting up a moral high ground and a common target. And I think we definitely thought about solidarity, but as we moved through sort of kicking off many campuses to see if many campuses were interested in taking this on, I think that Swarthmore and some of the first campuses really helped bring a deep ethic around climate justice and solidarity throughout, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So for 350, we got involved in divestment in November of 2012 with the Do the Math tour. And so it was Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and I think Van Jones. There were different folks speaking at different stops. And for me, the most exciting part of that tour was some of the field organizers organized Do the Aftermath parties, which was the first space where I met people who are now like movement family to me. You know, right after the Do the Math of thinking about the actual numbers of how we stay below 2 degrees means that 80% of fossil fuel reserves need to stay under the ground. That was actually really activating information, and I think people were looking for a space to gather and be ignited around something more than changing their light bulbs, but really building a movement to contest for power with the fossil fuel industry, and that was exciting for a lot of students. So in these aftermath parties was the first sort of strategy meeting, and all these ideas were flying around of how to kick off on their campus, and there was just so much support from the get-go. And so a lot of that, so, you know, I at the time was a West Coast organizer, and was going to be supporting, you know, the few campaigns that kicked off on the West Coast. And then I looked at my list, and I was like, all right, we have 70 campuses on the West Coast alone that are now kicking off divestment campaigns, and that was echoed nationally within, you know, a year. We're approaching 300 campuses, and so I think it wasn't just the sheer scale of how many campaigns were kicking off that makes divestment a movement. I think it's the way that some of the early leaders from Swarthmore, Brown, a lot of those universities, and Responsible Endowments Coalition, who really was doing that work before we kicked off the tour, kind of worked with 350 and then the student leaders starting to really form coordinated efforts, and how we coordinated and moved together, even though various campaigns had a lot of different asks, different principles. I think that's what was exciting for me, is whoa, we're actually have a coordinated effort around something huge. And so I think it started off with more of a declaration. A lot of for the campaigns that were kicking off, there were a lot of president letter deliveries, kind of declaring like, this is happening, this is what we're asking for. And something that's also invisibilized that is really important is there's a lot of training and team building. That was really important and really helped build some of the regional support and networks, because a lot of what made these campaigns successful is the connection between campuses and the connection between students and learning, sharing best practices and lessons. And that became more broadly shared and more deeply rooted and continues to as we go along. I think then we had the first convergence was at Swarthmore, our Power Up, which helped define some uniting principles around, like I mentioned, solidarity and what are, and looking more for the vision of where divestment takes us. And then, we had some national days of action, March 4th, Fossil Freedom Day. And then now we're really in a place that we are really looking at providing support, resources to the movement in a really collaborative way. So the Divestment Student Network is a more coordinated youth-led body that's really engaging in national strategy alongside the other organizational partners working on divestment. And we're really not just being aligned so that we don't, but actually working in solidarity. So we have a more holistic, coordinated effort that is really exciting, and I think taking us to a place where we're starting to think farther ahead, and yeah, more breadth and more depth. So.
And then, how many sort of campuses are in the process at any stage of organizing right now? You said there were 70 on the West Coast, and that was a little while ago.
Right, and not all of those. Yeah, I don't think it's 70 anymore, but I think it's up to about 400, and I think there are some people who there's a couple people who are like really trying to get going or start a petition, and then there are campaigns that have like 20 people organized in a team structure. So there's a big variety of those 400 campuses, and then I would be cuckoo bananas not to mention the incredible community divestment campaigns, because a number of cities have divested, and churches. That's a really incredible, bright, and victorious side to our movement that has grown out of on-campus divestment. That's really exciting. There's more than 100 campaigns, institutional campaigns outside of the campus campaigns, that are really exciting and changing the game. Even some state campaigns like divesting pension funds for California, for Massachusetts. So that's really exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And we're going to post resources and links on the page, but sort of if we're on the topic, if someone's watching and they're interested in finding the divestment movement in their city or on their campus, or they want to start it, sort of what's like the best first place to start?
I think a place that has a good, gofossilfree.org has a map of a majority of the campaigns. And then if you go to gofossilfree.org/commitments, you can see who's divested so far. And I think that's a good place to start.
Great. And then Dinah, you'd have thought about alumni organizing as well.
Yeah. Something that I think is just now taking off is the idea of a lot of students are reaching out to alumni of their college, and a lot of alumni are really interested in how can I get involved in the Divestment campaign, even though I'm not still there. And I know that on the Fossil Free website there's a tab for alumni to get involved, but definitely trying to contact writing letters to your president and getting involved in that way as an alum is really important because colleges really care about their alumni.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Especially because now we can imagine that those alumni are now in different positions, perhaps positions of influence. That's an exciting movement. And then specifically to sort of get into one story around successful divestment. Maybe Jess, do you want to talk about your experience at Pitzer? What was that like? How did it get started? Sort of some key takeaways from that experience.
Sure. So just to give a little bit of an update of where the movement's at in terms of really tangible progress. 12 schools thus far have divested, and even more institutional campaigns have won. But in terms of on-campus divestment, 12 have divested thus far. And as I mentioned before, my school, Pitzer, just divested this spring, which is really exciting. And that marked the largest endowment by over half to divest at that point. And we were campaigning for about 2 years and working as a 5-college campaign as the Claremont colleges, and really found that Pitzer had the most potential for a rapid win because of their stated values in environmental sustainability and social justice. So we really tapped into that kind of ethical and moral inconsistency that was their continued investment in the fossil fuel industry, and ended up creating a working group with 3 trustees, 3 students, 2 faculty, and 2 staff that met for the last 6 months, and eventually developed a plan to propose to the full board of trustees that included a holistic climate action plan, both investment issues as well as carbon emissions reduction, reinvestment, and really actions that could be taken on every level of the institution. And so that was really important for the trustees actually for us to win support of the trustees, was to approach it as a holistic issue of how do we tackle climate change and push for climate justice in as rigorous a way as possible. And so basically we created this final proposal after lots of groveling and negotiation in the boardroom, finally getting divestment on the table and keeping it there. And that proposal went to the full board in April. And actually the weekend of the 2nd annual divestment convergence, we found out secretively that the board was going to divest. And I was in the room with Deirdre at the convergence when I got the email saying confidentially that we were going to divest, and all it took was a nod and we both knew, and it was an incredibly beautiful, powerful moment. We were freaking out. And then got to tell the entire attendance of the divestment convergence that Pitzer was going to be announcing an announcement, kind of wink wink sort of thing, and everybody finally caught on. It was really, really exciting. And then following that, we had a press conference with Robert Redford, who happens to be a Pitzer trustee, the week after. So in the end, Pitzer has committed to divesting 99% of its endowment, reinvesting through a separate fund within the endowment, creating an environmental, social, and governance policy for the entire endowment, which is really a standard for socially responsible investment, as well as reducing carbon emissions by 25% in 2 years, and also creating an internal kind of structure in order to implement more policy changes in terms of sustainability and energy and all of that within the campus. So it was a huge kind of like broad-based win for us, and we were really, really excited. But But during that same time, a lot of other really amazing stuff was happening in the movement. So we were the 11th college to divest, and then 2 weeks later, Stanford University announced that they'd be divesting from coal, which is huge because they are the first non-liberal arts school. Actually, SFSU also has divested from coal and tar sands, but they're like the first huge big name school to divest, really kind of breaking us out of this mostly liberal arts kind of stalemate, and really just, I think, opening up the possibility for a lot more intense commitments from other big schools and putting really the pressure on to other prestigious universities. So they have an $18 billion endowment, which is massive, and that's a really big deal. Just that they're taking that even small step to divest from coal. Unfortunately, there have been a number of campuses that have been rejected by their administrations, primarily on the basis of costs and some really sketchy ties within the Board of Trustees to the fossil fuel industry, as well as some really questionable reports that are being released about how much it will cost to divest. And so there's a lot of work being done around that, especially in response to some reports from Cambridge and Associates. They rejected Pomona College in the fall, saying that it was going to cost them $485 million if they divested, which a number of financial analysts have remarked that that's a very sketchy number, that the analysis is not quite up to standard. So there's a lot of organizing going around to respond to those reports right now and take down those groups that are really kind of stagnating a lot of student action. But students are also responding in a lot of different ways. Particularly, escalation has picked up a lot this year as the movement has grown and gotten a lot stronger. There is some really exciting escalation happening through this kind of hashtag that we created called Beyond Earth Day. And so a number of campuses were getting involved in that. Students at Wash U, Students Against Peabody Coal, they did a 2-week-long sit-in, and it resulted in 7 students being arrested. And around that same time, Harvard also did a blockade on their campus and had the first student in the movement to be arrested at that time. And there were a number of other really creative and powerful actions happening around the country around Beyond Earth Day, really kind of enforcing this idea that we need to push beyond acting in terms of individualized sustainability measures and organize together and create and build a movement to fight the climate crisis. But what I'm even more excited about is really not necessarily these wins and kind of this list of victories that we're accumulating, but really how we are building this movement of young people and people outside of academic institutions, really of all generations, are getting involved in the divestment movement. And now moving on from these wins, we have the opportunity to really focus on reinvestment. And since I really believe that divestment is about leveraging our privilege within whatever institution we're a part of in order to make a really bold statement about the terrors of the fossil fuel industry and the disproportionate impacts of climate change and extraction, we also have the power post-divestment to move that money towards communities that are fighting on the front lines, that are most impacted, so that we can create resilient communities and really promote sustainable, democratized, decentralized, community-based energy production so that we can really push towards a just transition. So I know we'll be talking more about reinvestment later, but really it doesn't stop after the victories. And so at the Claremont Colleges, we're really psyched for pushing Pitzer forward in terms of its reinvestment plans, hopefully getting involved with some other organizations on how we can support some really cool projects coming up, and also then continuing to push the other 4 schools at the 5 Cs on divestment.
Yeah, you know, Jess, there's something that you're saying in there that for me is like maybe the core reason that I didn't mention earlier of why I think divestment is so awesome. And funny enough, it's actually in all of the rejections. It's in this like list of rejections and these crazy allegations that these universities are putting out. And really this like kind of huge overreaction from those in positions of traditional power to this movement that, for me, more than any other measure of success, shows that it's the right thing to be doing, because I get this feeling that people who have institutional power are scared, really, really scared. They feel this movement is around the jugular of what's propping them up, And even if it's not just economically but philosophically asking them to change their investments, I don't think we would be finding such harsh rejections in this movement if it wasn't truly a threat. So it's interesting that it's within the rejections that we might have the biggest measure of success, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that. And I think that, it's really not about necessarily the core announcement of divestment. I think that actually the biggest change happens along the way and through the process, not only by mobilizing all of these people to take part in this movement and building communities around organizing for climate justice, but also in the way we're challenging the way that decisions are being made in our institutions and the way we're talking about climate change on a mainstream level, and really the way that the fossil fuel industry has this stranglehold over our political process, over democracy, as well as over our economy. So it's really calling into question a lot of these systems of power, and in that shifting the narrative to this kind of intersectional analysis of systems of oppression and how they're all combined and really impacted by climate change. And so where we were looking at climate change for so long in this silo and attacking it by changing our light bulbs and recycling, now we're trying to shift the power, and we're trying to unite with other social justice issues and really build a strong movement that can really hit the power where it hurts and bring it back to the people.
Yeah, and I particularly love the vision of the sort of distributed, decentralized, community-based energy production. That's part of the reinvestment possibility. That's really, really inspiring, Jess. I think, Dinah, you had some thoughts, or you wanted to talk about the Divestment Student Network?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of another update on the status of the fossil fuel divestment movement right now. I think along the same lines that, like, reinvestment is the new wave of divestment and where the entire movement is heading. There's this developing network of students that is getting together to really increase the power that youth all together have around climate justice and specifically around divestment and reinvestment. And it's just a really exciting new organization that launched in October of 2013, and it's just gaining power in sort of the affiliation of campuses across the nation who are getting together to have shared campaigns, sharing mentorship with each other and lessons that they've learned from administrations, because you start learning after a while that the responses are always the same. And some of the greatest things that have come out of it are these convergences that have been mentioned before of, the first one that happened in 2013 at Swarthmore College, and then this fall in the Bay Area at SFSU. And it's really a space for students to come together with other people who are fighting against climate change and against fossil fuel extraction, and meeting all together to see where the intersections are and where our strength together is. So yeah, it's an exciting sort of update that's going to continue to grow in the student movement.
That is really exciting. And then if someone wanted to partake in the next one, when is that, and how do they plug it? What's the website?
Yeah, well, so there's the Divestment Student Network has a website that's studentsdivest.org. Okay,
we'll post that below as well.
It's down there, and it's an annual convergence now. So it's mostly student-led and organized and attended, but there's going to be another one probably next spring. And getting involved through the website and joining one of our democratic working groups is a great way to get involved in that.
That's great.
Yeah, Dinah, I just wanted to speak personally as someone who had the honor to actually do a training at the last divestment convergence. Mm-hmm. I guess I came into it not knowing what to expect of these different campuses and organizers, and as Deirdre was saying, like creating this huge firestorm of campuses kicking off campaigns. that seems like this huge question of, well, how serious are they? Like, do they actually intend to have a deep analysis, or are they just going to kind of keep it surface level? But what I found at that convergence was this rich, the whole framing of it was to dig deep and then to link up with other people and to move ahead and take action together. And so I think it's a critical part of this movement staying rich and making sure to not just stick with academic language and keep it in the classroom or on the campus necessarily, but to remind the movement what it's grounded in, and also just to recognize that the youth in that room, this generation seems to be willing to hold the tension of the complexity that the climate crisis requires. Oftentimes when I talk to older people, they're like, well, but how can we say that in a pithy soundbite? And I don't know what to say to them, because the reality is climate change can't be a pithy soundbite all the time. But the people in that room seem to be willing to really look at how complex these issues are and tackle that challenge head on. So it was incredibly important to me in how I see this movement moving. So.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I definitely observe that with you, Lauren, and others at PowerShift. So many young, activated people that are really able to understand the complexity. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality and climate justice in a little bit. Yeah, that's great. And then specifically, Deirdre, do you want to talk a little bit? We're going to have a future training on reinvestment, and go pretty deep into that. But sort of Jess queued it up really well, and I think to understand that sort of you're moving your money to something a much happier, better place. Sort of, do you want to speak to that, and what does that look like, and sort of what's evolving in that area that's exciting to you?
Yes, of course I will. I'm so excited. But I wanted to give a quick snapshot about one way we work together, because I think it's important in understanding when we say, because I'm going to talk a little bit about cross-sector and intersectionality, and one way that we've seen like Divestment Student Network be something that was that helped us set the stage and the frameworks to help us be a coordinated movement, and the dig deep, link up, and take action. Those are the three themes of our last convergence. And so I was one of the big picture facilitators and really helped hold the full space. And so you see like, oh, me from 350 using facilitation skills, linking up with folks in the DSN who are setting up some amazing frameworks. And those are that's some of the exciting ways that we work together and use the skills, understanding, frameworks, knowledge we have to create these spaces that I think is really beautiful. So I just want to mention that. And then, so reinvestment is really about, we're now really talking about power. And power comes in a lot of forms. You know, capital is a form of power. Capital, money, political capital. These are forms of power. And, visibility, that's a form of power. Having a megaphone, that's power. And so we're really, if we're looking at, if some of our end goals are really having, Jess started to bring it up, and our friends at MG really set up this framework of democratized, decentralized, distributed energy is what we need. So if we're really looking towards creating communities that have democratized, decentralized, distributed energy and community leadership, at the same time getting the climate policy, like a price on carbon that could support an infrastructure that can support those communities, but really taking leadership first from communities. What that means is a lot of cross-sector work happening, and and our movement working together in a way we never have, because we have to mitigate the climate crisis and adapt in our communities at the same time as we're transitioning to new systems that are sustainable. And that's a lot to do. And so when we're talking about power, I think in solidarity, I think what it's really about is like, who are the people most impacted? And often those people are the people with less given power. It's part of how they've been impacted in the first place. They less given power. And so those of us with more given power, like, I don't know, it's a huge form of power to be sitting on this huge pot of money at a university, and you have the ability to leverage a campaign to move that pot of money in a way that if a community just went to the university and said, hey, that money shouldn't be going. So if Richmond went to UC Berkeley and said, hey, actually that money is going to Chevron and that's poisoning us, it should be going to clean energy for our entire community. That community doesn't actually have the same power on campus to leverage alumni, faculty, and students to define what that institution is going to be and do. And so anyway, so thinking about some of those power dynamics and how, if we're wanting to get to our end goal, we need a movement that's more coordinated and working together. We start to think about roles, who should be doing what, and it's really the communities most impacted that understand solutions, how we create solutions on the ground. And so we have to be led. So I think, our reinvestment strategy is really about being led by the solutions blossoming up on the ground and playing our role. We've been really focused on weakening the bad, really targeting the fossil fuel industry and moving resources. And so if we can okay, we're building the new economy over here, and you're moving resources over here, and marrying those two roles to create a more holistic movement, to include also people who are strengthening democratic systems, people who are focused on labor and how to restore our labor and create jobs that regenerate our families and our economy, wealth within our families and our economy. That's actually the reinvestment. That's what we're doing on reinvestment, bringing together a number of different sectors that are doing incredible work, that if we work together, it would create an exponential power effect. And so it's really about, aside from, leveraging our power in a strategic
I think Deirdre got a little bit frozen.
Ooh.
Wait, coming back. You're back. You're back.
Okay. Are you sure?
You're definitely dancing, yes.
Yeah, dancing is a form of power. So I feel like I'm all over the place. So the main key thing is it's not, I don't want a lot of strategy.
I feel like there's some gold nuggets in there we're just missing out on.
Yeah, definitely. I feel conspiratorial about that.
The fossil fuel industry is trying to get involved here.
Right.
They know Deirdre is a threat to business as usual.
And what role we play in the movement, what power we have in the movement, and leveraging it back into our movement.
Yeah, I think a lot of, I'm pretty sure you're just talking about power again, if I caught that. I think a lot of what I was grappling with as I first started to organize in the climate movement was, well, this is about the climate, and it's about environments, and it's about energy, and I really realized it's not really about any of those things. Those things affect what it's actually about, which is people and how we live our lives. The reality is, I'm shocker, news alert, like climate change is happening. We can't stop it from happening to some extent. we can mitigate some of the worst impacts. And that's great. But when I started this movement, we were still rosy and believed that we could just stop it from happening. But if it is happening, and if indeed that means the rest of our lives as young people are going to be dealing with increasingly adverse consequences from that, then there is no, utopian society at the end of this rainbow. There is simply more rainbow, and that's okay. Rainbows are great. So what I'm trying to get at is, it's in how we treat each other and in how we live our lives that ends up actually mattering. That's the meaning within it. So that's why I think it's not only partially important, but completely critical for us to talk about social justice as the foundation of what this climate justice movement means. But maybe it's a good time to dig into maybe defining and unjargoning, as you might say, some of the terms that we've been throwing around. I realize we've been using climate justice. We use the term intersectionality. It's a really long one, and I think a few other terms. I'd like to unpack those a little bit, because the people on this call might really, talk about those things every day, but what do they actually mean? Yeah, I could rant, but I'd really like to hear some of your opinions.
Yeah, I mean, starting with climate justice, that is something that in my life we talk about every day in my work with Maypop. But it's exactly what you said about climate change, thinking about climate change as being something that is affecting and making worse and amplifying what has been going on in communities for decades, generations, hundreds of years, for many of them. And so in my work, we think of what the front lines of climate change is, so the people who are most affected, most impacted, are those front lines are people who are on the front lines of social justice issues, the issues of homelessness, of gentrification, of immigration, of racialized violence, and economic justice. And so it's looking past, even from a coalitional standpoint, of how can we all work together on a surface level. It's seeing how climate change affects and is an amplifier of all of these other struggles, and that's in the reason, because we're fighting for people, that's why we need to be fighting for solutions to climate change that are actually just and help to lift up those people who have been struggling for decades, not just sort of put a Band-Aid on this problem in terms of emissions.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of that, intersectionality as a term is really just another way of highlighting the connections between social justice issues and systems of oppression that are perpetuating all of these different social justice struggles that are just being further exacerbated by climate change and the impacts of the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel extraction. So when we talk about shifting the mainstream narrative around climate change, it's really trying to get us out of these dominant conversations of carbon emissions and talking about CO2 concentrations and sea level rise and all these kind of abstract numbers and sort of doomsday approach to really looking at the fact that this is a holistic human issue that's affecting not just all people, but in particular marginalized communities and historically oppressed communities disproportionately. And because of the interconnected nature of all of these issues, we really need to join together in the way that we attack the problems we're seeing today and will continue to see going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think maybe it's a good opportunity to sort of break it down and maybe talk a little bit specifically about sort of maybe theory of change and maybe from Deirdre, perhaps, sort of like what are the, just to break it down very plainly, when people participate in divestment and a school takes their, or a school or a community or other entity moves their money, what change does that affect? What is the strategy around that?
Yeah, I think there are a ton of goals achieved through it, but I think looking farther ahead of the sort of domino effect, Jess talked about the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry, and that we, no matter what kind of progress we wanted to make, whether it's in the policy in our local communities or clean energy in our local communities, all the way to federal and global policy on carbon, and who has the power to be making these decisions, is basically being held by the fossil fuel industry. And so we have a stranglehold on our democracy and on our energy systems. And so divestment is really about loosening that and about creating a moral high ground and asking our institutions that are really the building blocks of our society to take a stand against the fossil fuel industry, enabling opening up space and a pathway for carbon legislation, and which has to be inextricable from community ownership and governance over our food and energy systems. So that's the hope, is identifying the culprit and opening up space. And I think also, as Jess mentioned, opening up that space to see the intersections, or really what it is the root. To me, climate justice is really simple. It's about the root cause of climate, and if we so it's pointing out who the villain is and who the heroes are, and the heroes are people doing work on the ground that understand the solutions needed, and the villain is the fossil fuel industry. And by outlining that, it starts to create that space and a pathway towards the solution. And I think reinvestment really starts to articulate a clearer vision. So students are asking their universities to say, we will not invest in the wreckage of communities and our planet. So we're going to take our money out of these 200 companies that have 98% of the public reserves of fossil fuels. And then what's exciting is, where does that money go? And there's a lot of, and as a movement, we really want to point to the community solutions and infrastructure and new innovative infrastructures that are building towards some of the new systems that we want to see.
So just to add to that really quick, that's really on point, Deirdre. I think a lot of people ask the question, why divestment? It has nothing to do with reducing our carbon emissions. It has nothing to do with actual physical, tangible impact on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and therefore no tangible impact on the way that climate change is progressing. But really what it's doing is it's shifting the fight from an individual fight to a more communal, community-oriented, and powerful struggle based in organizing rather than sustainability, which, don't get me wrong, sustainability measures still have their place in the movement, but we're really looking to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry and call out this industry that has historically been allowed to dump out their trash for free. And that's really key in why divestment is so important in just this statement that is very often opposed because it's purely symbolic. But when we think about the history of social movements and social change, every big change starts with symbolic, powerful gestures and powerful statements to stigmatize a bad actor or an industry. And so divestment has been proven historically as a powerful tool, as mentioned before, in the fight against South African apartheid. It's also been used to stigmatize the tobacco industry. slavery, as Deirdre mentioned before, Sudan. And so in using this kind of historically tested tactic to bring light to the most pressing issue of our time, fossil fuel divestment is able to show both the public and also people in very high levels of power in terms of decision making, nationally, internationally, locally, that this industry is not compatible with the future that we need to sustain life on this planet and to sustain socially viable communities as well. It's not just about what's going to happen when the sea level rises, but also like what social factors are going to increase when it gets hotter. You know, like what kind of violence is going to result in that? What is governance going to look like as food and water shortages become more rampant, both in our country and around the world? So divestment is really trying to target the industry not in terms of taking money away from it to actually financially crumble it, but politically stigmatize the image of this industry as something that's not worthy of our investment going forward.
Yeah.
Oh.
Just
a quick note on the money part too. I think the first time we've actually talked about taking money away from the fossil fuel industry is with reinvestment. Because if you put money in clean energy, that is a permanent divestment from fossil fuels. As we grow clean energy and food, water, sovereignty infrastructures, that's a divestment before the investment. So that is a reinvestment is a slightly different strategy. And divestment, yeah, never about the money except for just a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm trying to kind of conceptualize this in a way that maybe I've thought of before, but so we have we're talking kind of about divestment and then also reinvestment as these two different 1-2 punch. And often in the climate movement, we talk about the idea of resistance paired with resilience, right? The idea of we have to push against the things that we don't like and then build up the things that we do like. So it's very paralleled with this idea of divestment and reinvestment. And resistance for me seems simple enough. We're trying to fight the things we don't like, and those are pretty easy to identify. But I feel like on the resilience side, I think about that term resilience and what does resilience in the face of an unstable future actually look like? And when we keep saying, when we, like Deirdre, you're saying, we put money into the clean energy economy and that forever takes it out of the fossil fuel economy, I want to think about what that means, because you also mentioned the idea of democratic ownership over energy production in communities. And when we talk about this idea, this basic, radical idea of democracy and re-democratization in America or beyond, I think that's something that we've forgotten. And I feel like it's really getting at this idea of taking centralized power and distributing it, which also for me means that a solution might not be reinvesting in a giant corporation that also wants to do giant, wind or whatever clean energy production. But to me, successful reinvestment might actually look like a lot of different diverse small-scale energy projects. So if someone wants to speak a little bit to what maybe false solutions would look like, yeah, let's talk about false solutions. Let's talk about how we don't want to keep recreating the same problem. Deirdre looks excited about it.
I've talked a lot, so I'll just kick it off with, for me, the basic thing is if a corporation owns the solution to the problem, what will that look like? And I think we can see a really great example of a false solution is GMOs, is Monsanto. There's a lot of others with carbon trading too. It's like the same carbon is happening in the atmosphere and communities are just worse off. How is that? But we have a system of trade. So it's that there are, within our system, it's really easy if we still have centralized power to play the game, to benefit, to make sure that the big companies, the people in power, are still profiting from whatever the system is. And that's why I say nothing can be inextricable from community leadership, is because we can see, just thinking about a carbon tax, think about so much depends on who is in power, who's consulted, right? And so GMOs is a good example because so Monsanto has the solution. If you are in drought and you can plant these seeds and they will grow, but what happens is that breeds monoculture, right? So we know that a healthy ecosystem has biodiversity. The most diverse systems survive the best because one storm comes and a certain species is wiped out. There are 7 other species slightly that had this one resistant gene, right? And so it's really science and ecology that tells us what kind of systems we need to survive. And so one key false solution, it's a false solution if it's one answer, first of all. So if there's, so now we see these GMO seeds becoming, the U.S. provides about 40% of the world's corn. 90% of that is GMO seed, is Monsanto seed, because it becomes increasingly impossible to plant other diverse plants, and the people and now the cost of the seed, instead of being able to be self-sustaining and self-resilient, you have to buy those seeds to have a thriving farm. And so again, we're dependent on a company that's breeding monoculture, that's breeding the thing that will kill us, right? So I think, and GMOs were offered as a solution to hunger, drought, bad conditions, but we'll be able to see how if one storm or one pest or there's a specific thing that species is vulnerable to, it will wipe out 90% of our corn crop, as opposed to us having thousands of different types so that we're resilient. So false solutions, usually you can see how they attack self-reliance and resiliency.
I think that's a great example of a false solution. And then maybe just to go sort of quickly popcorn style amongst the people here, what are the great solutions? Sort of like what are, you're talking to someone that has the opportunity very quickly to reinvest in something. What are the top 1 or 2 or 3 sort of best places to go, maybe resources, programs, individual vehicles, just to give some specificity around this so people can envision what that alternative is. Go ahead, Deirdre.
I just don't want to spoil the reinvestment moot.
I know.
This is a preview. This is just like top line, like what are those things, just so I can Google them afterwards.
Yeah, so I would go to ourpowercampaign.org, as well as look at KFTC, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and Southern Grassroots Economies projects are all incredible, innovative, community-owned and governed projects that we'll be working with.
Great. Any thoughts on that, Jess or Dinah or Lauren?
Yeah, that sounds good. I would just also plug the Climate Justice Alliance, which is doing really good, interesting work about that stuff, and Movement Generation also. And we're going to be joined next time in the Reinvestment Moot by Gopal Dayanani, who's got a lot of incredible knowledge around this stuff, which is also related to our Power campaign. Yeah.
Great, good reinvestment preview. And Lauren, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we can enter into kind of a general questions and discussion time, right? So I have a number of different questions. I'm trying to think of which one makes the most sense right now. So I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but just to really articulate it, this isn't an economic strategy. Like, the idea isn't to take all of the fossil fuel money out of colleges and then that'll just solve the problem and make all of them crumble and we can build a new future. So do you guys just want to speak a little bit more to the ulterior motives of the divestment movement and how that's just part of it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Dinah.
Yeah. I think we covered it a little bit in the theory of change of what divestment is. I hope that the motives aren't ulterior, and I hope that we are very open about what we want with the divestment movement, which is to show beyond the words and the sort of platitudes that many institutions say around. Of course, we believe in climate change, and we think that action should be taken. Taking that next step and really showing with money, which is something that is very important to institutions, that they're willing to actually put money behind those words. That shows politicians, it shows other decision makers, we're actually willing to take action around this issue. And the next step is, if you're not willing to take action on climate change, then we're going to come after you next. And so that's what we hope to be showing, with using this economic tactic.
Cool. That actually kind of sparked another question that I've been mulling over in my head, which actually has less to do with the targets of the divestment movement, but rather maybe more of a question of how you keep the divestment movement with students meaningful. Because it seems like to me, like the idea of doing solidarity organizing and dealing with this question of economics on campus, and then being in a campus and on a university campus in general, can create a bubble, right? Where like we can talk about these things and use the right rhetoric and speak academically, but like you were saying, Dinah, you went out to Appalachia and you saw the destruction. So what are ways that the divestment movement can keep the real reality of what they're fighting for fresh, as opposed to kind of getting caught up with being able to say the right things all the time?
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge for most student groups working on divestment, especially because trustees and administrators favor that focus on the financial conversation, because they know that at the end of the day, they hold the keys to the information about the school's financial holdings, and most students don't have access to that information, and it makes it a lot more difficult for students to be able to actually make powerful and valid statements against trustees' arguments that it's going to cost exorbitant amounts of money, etc. So really trying to make sure that we're rerouting to those ethical conversations about what kind of risk we're actually talking about. So trustees are really interested in talking about like risk versus returns, and what kind of money are we going to lose from divesting, and also like what bang for our buck are we getting from taking this action. And what we tried to do at Pitzer and the 5 Cs is really think about risk in a different way and look at, okay, what are the actual risks of climate change on communities around the world, and like what risks do we actually want to be focusing on, because if we continue to place risk of investments over the risks that are posed to human life and to social equity, then we've got a severe imbalance of priorities. So I think that one of the things that's really important and really exciting that a lot of campuses are getting involved in is starting to build relationships with local groups who are fighting for climate justice, environmental justice, and other social justice issues on the ground, on the front lines, and really making sure that those solidarity networks are becoming more powerful between student groups and those groups such as like the mountaintop removal activists in Appalachia that the Swarthmore campaign has been working with. I don't know, Dinah, if you want to add anything in personally about that.
And then let me just insert something here, like, because I'm curious, Jess, from your experience, when you alluded to this earlier, so Pitzer College has a stated commitment to the environment and the future world of its students, and then when you came to them and you sort of illuminated for them this sort of hypocrisy, which I imagine was a sort of essential part of the argument, as you said, was that what was the reaction to that? And so, especially I'm thinking about other students and other people that might be watching and that might approach it the same way. Sort of like, what can they anticipate when they present that argument?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about divestment and the movement is that each campus and organizing on each campus is very different based on the politics of that particular administration, the trustees, as well as the student body. The political climate on campus really makes a big difference, as well as institutional values and mission, if your institution even has that. I was talking to a student from University of Pennsylvania here in Philly. It said that UPenn doesn't even have a mission statement. So we really strongly leveraged our mission statement and stated values at Pitzer for our campaign because they had written as founding values that they're very committed to social responsibility and environmental sustainability and community empowerment and taking action on issues that matter socially. So we very much highlighted that hypocrisy from the very beginning, and they were like, okay, yes, we know, like, this is in our mission, we need to take action on climate change, we need to do something. But then it became more of a conversation about, well, what is actually the best tactic for us to take? And they questioned actually like the power of divestment and whether it was actually going to make a big enough difference because it wasn't going to be limiting carbon emissions at all. And then when we were pushing the political argument of, okay, well, no, we're stigmatizing the industry, and we're like opening up channels in order to implement effective and strong climate policy, they were like, well, you should just start a letter writing campaign. And which advice. And basically what ended up being able to shift their allegiances towards divestment was focusing on the fact that if Pitzer was going to take the most robust and holistic action on climate change possible, it could not exclude investment actions nor carbon emissions reductions, and really steps that could be taken on every level of the institution. So once we got agreement on that, then we were able to say, okay, we know that morally, because of our stated values and our commitment to doing something about climate change, we have to do some form of divestment. Then we were able to work up from the most minimal amount of direct holdings divestment, meaning just the easiest funds for the school to divest, to getting to a much more aggressive plan, which is now at 99% divestment by December. And so now we're still trying to convince them to push for a full phase out in 5 years. So we're not quite done yet. But yeah, I hope that helps answer your question a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. And that really helps me sort of imagine what it's like to be in the room and go through that process. Great job.
I guess I was just going to say a little bit more about students connecting with communities, because I think that's part of the really exciting growth that we're seeing. And also just reflect on the times that Jess and I would be infuriated, frustrated, and laugh together. Of it's great, you want a price on carbon? All right, go get it. Oh wait, we have to actually do things to get there. It's like a teenager asking for a car. and their parents saying like, okay, go to work, and being like, that's not a car, right? You gotta like earn the money and save it up. Anyway, it's just funny. So what's really exciting is, we've experimented with a lot of different ways of connecting students and communities. One was like 350 and the Divestment Student Network worked together on these things called grows, where in a couple different spots across the nation brought together folks who were working on community divestment, folks who were working on campus divestment, and then a number of other issues locally, including prison industrial complex, immigration, lots of great labor, to talk about the work and start to seed ideas of what it would look like to be supporting each other more locally. And also, there's a fellowship. 350 does a fellowship over summer where divestment students plug into campaigns that don't necessarily have anything to do, usually actually don't have to do with divestment, sometimes do, to build community relationships. And then I think it's always the summer that we think of this, but I think this summer there are some really incredible opportunities for folks to get more connected to what it looks like to really fight for a community, or what it looks like on the front lines, as well as like the opportunity of reinvestment really creates the space for that shared work within the semester.
And if people are interested in that, that's really exciting. So is there, we'll of course have the resource below, but like what's a good first step for people?
Well, just to totally shamelessly plug something I'm working on, and I've been working on a lot. So part of one of the things that came out of the last divestment convergence was this idea to create some sort of partnership between students on the West Coast and some of the impacted organizing work I've been doing out here in Utah against the tar sands, which if you're with Hatchery, you've followed along what's happening out here. But we're going to be bringing a bunch of students out in late July to a tar sands extraction pit and spending a week talking about not just tar sands in Utah, but hearing stories from a number of different people from impacted communities across what's called the Colorado Plateau, part of which is where Deirdre used to organize down in New Mexico, and connect this story of extraction and the communities that are most impacted by the extraction from their own perspective, and hopefully have students there to hear those stories and connect in a meaningful way to what this movement's really about, face to face. So we can link the Summer for Climate Justice Action Camp on there, and that's only one of a couple other pretty cool opportunities this summer to plug into.
That's great. Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah. Shameless, like I said.
And if folks are interested in being involved in reinvestment, it's a collaborative effort, truly. And I'm lucky enough to help coordinate a lot of the aspects of the sort of launch. So we'll have a website. It's not up yet. But you should email me, and I will plug you in with the right people. Is actually a weird but great way to start. I'll definitely get back to you. So, and my email's easy because it's just my name at 350.org.
Deirdre at 350.org. And there's a question that came in from Twitter from School of Change. It was directed at you, Deirdre, and you alluded to some trainings that you did sort of early on. And I know School of Change is involved in education. They were curious around sort of what was most successful around those early trainings. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll say something quick, but I invite Jess and Dinah because they also engaged in a lot of training. I mean, Jess, knows what's in those early trainings as much as I do because I was down at the 5 Cs Claremont Colleges where Pitzer is a lot. But I think really engaging in movement strategy through, especially through like playing with kinesthetic exercises like we use something called the triangle game to look at how social movements, how one university can help actually shift a paradigm, are really empowering, and starting from movement strategy and going down to campaign strategy, going down to really build team structures and what that looks like was a really inspiring arc. And using a lot of tools like spectrum of allies, like stages of a campaign, movement pillars are some of the tools, but yeah, that we used. So I think that was that seemed to be some of the most effective, was really digging into movement strategy, because students had grabbed onto, I don't want to change my light bulb, I want to build a movement to solve this crisis that is huge.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of what we started with at Swarthmore was with doing those trainings and doing that, honing strategic thinking as part of our campaign. And we got a lot of mentorship from this organization called Training for Change, which has a website with a lot of resources on trainings, on movement strategy, and a lot of those kinesthetic activities like Deirdre was talking about. And so I would really say that has done a lot for shaping my own mind as a social change maker in general. That's where we started with our divestment campaign.
That's great, and maybe we can pull out some of those, the structure on those, or the instructions for those, and put it in the resource section to pass those forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know we're getting short on time. I'm just so sad because I love talking to you, beautiful people. And can I just say, I mean, I love you, Ryan, but women, I have to say, I think that it's pretty illustrative of who is pushing this movement forward, and it's a lot of really strong and beautiful and hardworking women. So I just wanted to say that. It's pretty awesome. I guess if I have one last question for everyone, it's what does action in or working towards this divestment or reinvestment movement really look like to you, whether you're a student or an alumni or supporter? And I would also maybe for my own answer just challenge in saying that even starting to educate yourself about movements like this is going to put you on a path towards a serious paradigm shift, which is in and of itself maybe the most important kind of action I can think of. But yeah, what does action mean for you guys?
For me, I think my first step that really put me on this path was joining a group of people who are united together to take collective action on climate change. And I think joining any group like that really has an analysis of power and how people together can create change because they are the ones that have power, that for me completely changed my idea of like what I wanted to do with my life and what I thought was a meaningful use of my time, and gave me this community also to foster my growth in that and empower myself. And so yeah, I mean, joining with a group of people is what action means to me.
Final thoughts on that, Jess or Deirdre?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. I could probably contemplate this for days and talk about it for hours, but yeah, I completely second what Dinah said, and I think for me the most powerful part of being involved in this movement has been building relationships, and organizing a powerful movement is really about strong relationships and creating lasting bonds with people that maybe you didn't expect to be working with, and really sustaining those. So building community for me is really, really important, and I think is what's going to get us through this crisis. You know, we can't end climate change, but I think it's how we come out the other side or keep going through it. You know, it's really we have to do that together, and we have no other choice but to be with really awesome people and learn from each other. So I guess if I had a recommendation, it would also be to just really tap into communities of organizing and educate yourself about how we can work together to resist some of the power imbalances that we're facing today and how that ties with climate change, and then talk to people about it and build strong friendships around that resistance.
Thanks, Jess. Final thoughts, Deirdre, before we wrap it up?
Just that, you know, most of us are connected to an institution of some kind, and really finding our power to leverage that institution towards greater change and getting together with some of your allies within. I'm part of an institution called 350.org. I work to leverage power with 350 all the time, you know, and it makes a huge difference for our movement. So I think really looking at the institutions you're involved in, and redressing their, you know, helping to shape the lens with which they're viewing their power and how it should be used.
That's great, thank you. I'd like to just broadly thank every single person in here, Lauren, Jess, Deirdre, Dinah. The work is so important, and as we discussed, this is an incredibly powerful movement and a huge tactic that I feel like we're just in the second inning of. And it's so exciting to have everyone together to share these lessons and to see where it grows from here. Look for, as we've been alluding to multiple times, a future massive open online training specifically on reinvestment to get very specific around that, and other ones. And I'd just like to thank everyone for joining this Hero Hatchery training, and look for this listed on herohatchery.org. And please stay in touch. I'd say I'm going to commit all of us to answering individual questions from everyone. I think we're all pretty available.
Thanks, Hero Hatchery.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Yay!
Through to like the old sign off. The dating game. The dating game. Thank you. Take care.